as Pesach goes round and around and around, each vessel that comes up renews a particular type of energy. So the first time it happened, for example, the first time Pesach happened, it represented, it symbolized the elements of freedom. And therefore each year, the creation of a nation, therefore each time it comes round, as we go through the months, each time it comes around, we renew this concept of freedom. And therefore one of the themes of the Seder is freedom from a self-imposed exile. Last week we discussed how one of the elements of exile or imprisonment or boundaries is based upon ego. This week the representation of the Seder plate in connection to Pesach is effectively giving you the keys or the interface, the tools, in order to take you through the Seder. And each step of the Seder is another step, leaving behind a so-called self-imposed exile or a self-imposed limitation. And the Seder plate is that interface, those tools that will enable you to get through the Seder, and in turn, each one of themselves, each part of the Seder plate represents a different tool and a different element of this journey to freedom. So you have the entire Seder, which is a macro, long journey. In some cases, takes anything from 2 to 4 hours, depends on which Seder you go to. While the Seder plate itself is a sample taster, so to speak, or a mini tool set, multi like a Victorinox tool set or Leatherman compared to a workman's toolbox. So, by going through the Seder plate and analysing it, you can pick up and see how the various options and various tools that you can utilise throughout the Seder and throughout your own life on a daily basis. And so that's the purpose of this particular shiur in the time that we have. So the very basic kaira, the basic set of the kaira, is you have the 3 matzahs. The top matzah corresponds to Kohen, the priestly family. The next one under that is Levi, corresponding to the generic priestly family of which the Kohanim are part of, and which the Leviim are those who play the musical instruments and kept the temple tidy, so to speak. Also in charge of educational elements. And then you have the Yisraelim on the bottom, which Kohen and the Leviim back in the ancient times also now were founded upon. Without the Yisraelim, without the other 10 tribes, without the other 11 tribes, the Kohanim and the Leviim, which was from the same tribe, wouldn't have anything to be found, wouldn't be able to be supported. The whole temple was supported by the other 11 tribes, which were the Yisraelim. So therefore you have Kohen and Levi residing on top of Yisrael. The masses themselves also correspond to several different symbolisms associated with them. We also have the top matzah corresponds to Abraham. The next one after that, the next matzah corresponds to Yitzchak, and the bottom matzah corresponds to Yaakov. What is well known that each one of those forefathers also correspond to a particular midah, a particular attribute or emotional trait. Avraham corresponds to Chesed, kindness. He was known as a Ish Chesed. He worked very hard in spreading kindness. He had an Eichel, a hotel, where he would look after people. Yitzchak was known as Gevura because he resided in Eretz Yisrael. He focused on himself. People did come to him. He helped people, but very much it was about character refinement on himself. And finally, you have Yaakov, who corresponds to Tiferes, the culmination of having that kindness, but in correct amounts, with good boundaries, with healthy relationships. And that was Yaakov, and also we're told that Yaakov had his entire house was perfect, as in all his children were righteous. While with Avraham and Yitzchak, one was a Rasha, one was wicked, the other one was righteous. You had Yitzchak and Yishmael, you had Yaakov and Esav, but with Yaakov you had all his family were perfect, they were all righteous, all tzaddikim, and that stemmed from the attribute, his emotional capability of Tiferes, of harmony, finding that balance to be able to educate the children, but in good measure and in the appropriate way. And then finally, the third element that we have is the 3 masses correspond to Chochmah, Bina, and Das. The top one corresponds to the 3 intellectual capacities. So you have wisdom, then you have comprehension, which is Bina, which is Yitzchak and Levi, and then you have Gevura, and then you have Das, which corresponds the bottom master, which corresponds to Yisrael, Yaakov, and Tiferes. So those are the 3. So that's just something interesting, so to speak, but obviously we'll go into and describe how it actually fits in to what we're doing. That will be the culmination at the end. What is interesting to know is there's obviously different halachic requirements with the matzah, but one of the elements of the matzah, at least many people have the custom that the matzah should be concave, should be like a bowl. We're not obviously not talking about aviv matzahs or all the machine baked matzahs, because those are flat. But shmura matzah, hand-baked shmura matzah, generally you will either have the flat ones, which are not really flat, they have like obviously dips and ridges, but a lot of the shmura matzah actually is concave. And there is a custom, especially within Chabad, to have concave bowl-shaped matzahs. Doesn't mean literally they're bowls, but you'll see a bit of dip in the matzah. And there's a reason for that, which we'll get to in a minute. So that's the matzah itself. So the three matzahs are separated, and then we actually have the kaira, which sits on top of the matzah. So the kaira gets really interesting. Obviously, we have the different foods. So we have the zeroya, the chicken neck, or generally it's a chicken neck. Then you have the egg. Then you'll have the mora. Then you'll have the charoises, which is the apple almond mixture. Walnut mixture. Then you'll have the carapace, and finally, which is potato, onion, parsley. I know that people have other customs within that. And then finally, on the bottom, you have again mora, but it's called chazeres. But it's a derivative of mora. Sometimes you can do it the same as the mora in the middle. So again, you have the 6 different formats. And if you look at the actual if you look at the form that you place it down on the kaira, it has it has right, left, middle, right, left, middle. Again, corresponding, at least with the Chabad Kairas. I did have an Ashkenazi, actually this is the Ashkenazi, no, this is a Rizal one. I did have an Ashkenazi Haggadah, but I think Ashkenazim also do 6.
Sorry?
Ashkenazim also do 6 things, yeah. I think they do it around more, maybe.
Correct.
But each one of the 6 items on the Kaira correspond to of the 6 emotions. So you have chesed, kindness, gevura, severity or discipline. You have tiferes, which is beauty or harmony. Then you have netzach, which is perseverance, or can be also translated as success, because you can only be successful if you persevere at something. And then you have humility, hoid. And on the bottom you have yesod, which is foundation or confidence. So each one of those correspond to a different midah. So just to run through again, zeroya, even though it's meant to be, it's meant to represent the korban pesach, the roasted lamb. However, we use the chicken bone, and it's called zeroya. Zeroya doesn't mean a chicken bone. Zeroya means an arm. An arm with an outstretched. So why do we call it zeroya? Is because the pasuk says that with an outstretched arm, God took the Jewish people out of Egypt. And the idea of the outstretched arm also corresponds to the idea of doing something with kindness. You're either giving something, you're taking away. Well, you're not taking away. You're bringing them out. So God did a kindness to the Jewish people, and therefore Zeraya corresponds to Chesed. Then you jump over to the Be'ah, the egg. Egg generally symbolizes what? When the egg's generally eaten? Morning. So the egg, while it may seem sad, it's not actually per se sad. What it actually represents is the cycle of life. It represents mourning, so the cycle. So it's the idea of Gevurah. The idea of Gevurah, discipline or severity, is that everything has to have a rule. Nothing can be. You cannot have chaos. If you have chaos, things do not function. Gevurah represents a world where everything has a rule, a time, and a place. There is life, there is death. There is life, there is death. And therefore, the egg is one of the elements of what the egg symbolizes is this idea of Gevurah. What time is it? 36.
Is the idea of what?
I'm not sure how I'm going to pull this one off.
Is the idea of what?
Everything has a time and a place. Everything has rules. Then we have the Mora. The idea of the Mora represents Tiferes. The Mora, the middle Mora, represents the idea of Tiferes. Harmony. What's harmony? Harmony is when you have both. When you have the balance. When you have the ability to be kind to the right people. When you are strict and disciplined in the right time. And Mara, which is bitter, you can only have something's bitter only comes because there was bitterness only happens. You recognize when something is bitter because you recognize you have something to compare it to. Bitter stems from the idea, the bitterness or the harshness of Mara. It comes from the idea that there is discipline, but you also are able to base yourself on that bitterness, on that negativity, to do something better or to become happy once again after that. One of the elements of Mara, of bitterness, or of Tiferes, is having those two composite capabilities, two opposing forces. I'm going to speed it up a bit. Then finally we have Netzach. Netzach is perseverance and success, represents by the charoises. The idea of the charoises is specifically obviously the cement, but also the building of the Jews used cement to build the bricks and so on and so forth. Therefore, charoises is supposed to be a recognition of that, a remembrance of that. But that specifically, it was through the hard work and through the perseverance they managed to stay alive, i.e., representing the idea of Netzach, that eventually they came out alive as a stronger nation. Jumping over to Carapace, the idea of humility. Obviously, there's a lot more to this, but we don't have that much time. But the idea of carapace is that the actual potato or the onion are root vegetables. They're actually inside the ground. And yet, when you take them out, they become the base sustenance for life. The reality is, well, it's not the best diet, but onions and potatoes and root vegetables can be the base sustenance for one's life. And that comes from humility. Humility is related to Hod. And Hod humility is one of the foundations of life. Without humility, if you lead your life in a arrogant or egotistical way, eventually you're going to fall. Eventually, someone is going to take you down. The idea of having humility allows you to balance that out. And finally, we have Yesod, which is foundation and balances. If you look at it, it's actually the pinnacle of everything of the six attributes. Is the pinnacle one, which everything else balances on. And therefore, Yesod is that with a healthy foundation, with a healthy balance of all the other attributes, what you're able to do is actually able to accomplish in life. That's why it's directly underneath Teferes, which is representative of harmony. Again, the same balance as we call the Kava Emsa, the middle line. To wrap it up, we said before, why is it necessary to have the masses which are concave? And the idea is that these three masses represent also the intellectual capacities, Chochma, Bina, Das, wisdom, comprehension, and understanding. That when you have the emotional attributes, these six that we've just said, the Netzach, Hod, Yesod, the kindness, the severity, the harmony, the perseverance, the foundation, the humility inside your intellectual capabilities, controlled by your mind, as opposed to controlling your life with pure emotion. But if you combine the two together, your intellectual capacity is fused with your emotional capacity, and you allow the mind, the moach shala alev, if you allow the mind to control if you allow the mind to control the emotions, then that's one of the first steps to freedom. And that's why setting up the kaira, the Seder plate in the very beginning of the Seder, is to give you that start of that intellectual or the mindset in the beginning of the Seder, that throughout the whole journey of the Seder, the journey of the steps of the Seder, without recognizing that your emotional capacity has to be controlled by your intellectual capacity, then the Seder might not quite function the way you want it to function. But that's the very foundation which the Seder begins off with the emotions controlled by the intellect.